To look at the political, social, and economic influences of our food and food safety system, we need to go back in time. Back to an age where you couldn't take for granted you weren't eating worms, wax, sawdust, or worse. And it's easy to forget our sordid and nasty past. We open our pantries and fridges, go to our stocked grocery stores every day without thinking thoughts like who made it? Is it really just tomato sauce? Is it really safe or clean? We've moved from an age of distrust to one of total and complete blind trust. In food, in our suppliers, and in our laws, we trust. But it wasn't always that way. So over the next 6 weeks, we'll delve deep into our nation's nasty history with food to learn about the riots, the losses, both of financial and human life, and politics that shaped our food law system. And this week, we're beginning with political influence. And it's important that when we begin, we define what political influence looks like and distinguish it from political action. This is political influence. We have a president that on the campaign trail described the FDA as food police and inspection overkill, which raises questions like, could the president eliminate the FDA entirely? Likely no, but maybe pressure for less rulemaking. We did see a freeze on new rulemaking, freeze on hiring and promotions. Those are political influences. Pressures for less guidance documents, which is in particular of importance with the Food Safety Modernization Act. Maybe pressure for less enforcement by less hiring or directives to use the budget. These are limited resource agencies after all, to do something else. And that's very different than political action. Political influence and political action are totally different beasts, and we can't confuse the two. So political action, the passage of the Pure Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act, the first federal food safety laws that we had, that's political action. These had been laws that were kicked around and debated long before 1906, I think for at least 5 years. There were several drafts of these that were sitting around, but finally were passed, and passed not due to political action, but due to social and economic influences, and that's different. So this is an end result versus an influence. Passage of the 1938 Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, which we've had all the way through 2011 before the amendment with the Food Safety Modernization Act, that's political action. We can look at the 1958, 1960, and so on, these amendments that we had to food additives, to color additives, animal drug, and so forth, and along with the Delaney amendments from Representative Delaney pictured here, that's political action. So we can define political action as a response, a solution. And one example, 107 deaths in 1937, that took Congress to the point of actually passing the 1938 Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. The 1938 Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act had been something Congress had discussed since 1933. In other words, they had the tools, they had the legislation in place, kicked around and debated since 1933 that potentially, if not definitely, could have prevented those 107 deaths in 1937. But it wasn't until those deaths occurred and the corresponding economic and social influences led to political influences, led to political action. So we have this causation chain, which political action is at the end of, but is not an influence. So what is political influence? It's what we talked about in the beginning. It's about working with existing laws, either for priorities, interpretations, and how new laws are created. One of the examples that we have this week is with aspartame. That's fitting a food additive into an existing framework and pushing it to make it come out and work within the existing framework. We can look at another example with the Food Safety Modernization Act with the Hagen-Tester Amendment that exempted qualified suppliers from the Food Safety Modernization Act, the preventative controls. There we have a situation where farmers and their constituents did not want to be part of the framework that was coming through Congress, and there was an exemption crafted to get their votes to ensure the passage of that law. And this new law was created with this very detailed exemption for farms primary, secondary farms, qualified suppliers, and so forth. And that's another form of political influence. So when we talk about political influence, what we want to think about is existing laws or the lobbying and formation of new laws, but not necessarily the passage of a law. The passage of a law is political action. And throughout our history, we do not have political action until we have some sort of influence. And not often is it political influence. More often, it's social and economic influence that leads to new laws. Typically, when we talk about political influence, we are talking about the influence of existing laws, how those laws are interpreted, how those laws are enforced. So we want to make sure as we go through the material this week that we're keeping those two separate: political influence, political action. Make that distinguishment when you're talking about it in the discussion board and in your materials, and don't confuse the two. Political action is different than political influence.